If you shot Nikon in the film era, chances are some of these lenses never really left your memory. From the little 28 that so many photographers actually carried, to the 105mm f2.5 that became almost part of Nikon itself, and yes, to the Noct that still feels like a dream lens, this list is for the people who remember what these names meant. Welcome to Alt Buzz Lenses, where we talk about the glass that actually mattered. Hit that subscribe button and let's begin. At number 10, we have the Nikkor 24mm f2.8. Compact, serious, honest. It was not the widest Nikon made, it was not the fastest. But it had something that mattered far more than either of those things. It had character that matched the photographer who carried it. If you were a working Nikon shooter in the film era, moving through streets, squeezing into tight rooms, building pictures out of real light and real space, this was the wide angle that made sense. It did not announce itself, it just worked every single time in a way that made you trust it completely. And trust, when you are shooting film, is everything. You cannot chimp. You cannot delete. Every frame costs something. And so every piece of glass you put on your body has to earn its place. The 24mm earned its place quietly, consistently, and without ever needing to prove itself through mythology. The photographers who used it knew. They still know. And if you were one of them, you are already nodding. At number 9, we have the Nikkor 28mm f2.8s. If the 24mm was the lens serious photographers respected, the 28mm was the lens serious photographers actually carried. And there is a difference between those two things that only real shooters understand. This was the little Nikon wide, the one that lived on the camera, the one that came out of the bag first and went back in last. It was small enough that you forgot it was there, and sharp enough that you were always glad it was. There's something almost emotional about a lens like this, not because it was glamorous, not because it turned heads in a camera shop, but because it was genuinely useful in a way that very few pieces of glass ever achieve. It fit the way photographers actually worked, wide enough to give you room, fast enough to give you light, small enough to give you freedom. If you shot Nikon back then, you remember the 28mm, the way you remember a good pair of shoes. Not the ones you admired in the window, the ones you wore every day until they knew your feet. That is the 28mm f2.8s. It is not a lens people write poems about. But it is absolutely a lens people still think about. And for this audience, that quiet kind of remembrance means more than any amount of legend. If this kind of video is what you have been looking for, real camera history, real photographic memory, not just specs and rankings, then this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe and stay with us, because this list is only getting better from here. At number 8, we have the Micro-Nikkor 55mm f3.5. The Micro-Nikkor 55mm f3.5 earned its place through precision. This was the lens that reminded you Nikon thought differently about optics, not just in terms of focal length or aperture, but in terms of what glass could actually do when it was designed with absolute seriousness of purpose. The Micro-Nikkor was built for close-up work, for the kind of photography that demanded perfection at distances where most lenses simply gave up. And it delivered that perfection with a consistency that made it a reference point. Not just among macro shooters, but among anyone who cared about what a Nikon lens could really be when pushed to its limits. There is a specific kind of respect that comes from a lens like this. It is not the respect you feel for something fast or something beautiful. It is the respect you feel for something that is genuinely, deeply, uncompromisingly good at what it does. The Micro-Nikkor 55mm f3.5 was that. Photographers who used it understood something about Nikon that the spec sheets never fully captured, that Nikon, at its best, was not just building lenses, it was building instruments. At number 7, we have the Nikkor 35mm f1.8. f1.4s. Every photographer has a lens they wanted before they could have it. A lens they saw in a shop window or in another photographer's bag and felt something shift inside them. A lens that felt like a destination rather than just a purchase. For a lot of Nikon shooters in the film era, the AI Nikkor 35mm f1.4s was exactly that lens. It was fast in a way that felt almost reckless for a wide angle. f1.4 at 35mm meant you could shoot in light that would stop almost any other lens in its tracks. It meant shallow depth of field at a focal length where depth of field was not supposed to be the point. It meant Nikon had built something that defied the comfortable logic of what a wide-angle lens was supposed to be and handed it to photographers who were serious enough to know what to do with it. This was not a lens for everyone, and that was entirely the point. Maybe you owned one. Maybe you wanted one for years before you could afford it, or before you finally let yourself spend that kind of money on glass. Maybe you just knew someone who had one and felt a very specific kind of photographer's envy every time you saw it mounted on a body. However it entered your memory, it stayed there. Because the 35mm f1.4s was not just a wide-angle lens, it was a statement about how seriously you took your photography. And in the Nikon film era, that statement meant something real. At number 6, we have the Nikkor-S Auto 55mm f1.2. There are lenses that define an era, and then there are lenses that feel like they arrived slightly ahead of their era. Lenses that carried a kind of ambition that the market had not quite caught up with yet. The Nikkor-S Auto 55mm f1.2 was one of those lenses, and it gave the Nikon system something that very few manufacturers could match at the time. A fast, normal lens that felt genuinely prestigious. f1.2 on a 55mm was extraordinary. It meant available light shooting at a level that opened up entire worlds of photography that slower glass simply could not access. Theater, dim interiors, candlelight, the kind of situations where photographers used to pack up and go home suddenly became workable, suddenly became interesting. And Nikon had put that capability into a lens that was built with the same quality and seriousness that defined everything the brand stood for in that period. This was not a compromise lens. This was Nikon saying, quietly and confidently, that they could do things other manufacturers could not. The Nikkor-S Auto 55mm f1.2 gave the Nikon system prestige of a very specific kind. Not the mythological prestige of the Noct that comes later, and it arrives differently. This was the prestige of capability, of a manufacturer proving early and convincingly that fast glass and serious optics were not mutually exclusive. If you were a Nikon photographer in that era, you understood what this lens represented, and if you shot with one, you never forgot it. We are halfway through this list, and it is only getting more serious from here. If you are watching this and feeling that pull of recognition, that sense that somebody finally made the Nikon video you actually wanted to watch, subscribe right now. There are more videos like this coming, and you do not want to miss them. At number 5, we have the AI Nikkor 85mm f1.4s. Some lenses are tools, some lenses are instruments, and some lenses are objects of genuine desire. The kind of glass that photographers talk about in hushed tones, that sits at the top of wish lists for years, that represents not just optical excellence, but a kind of photographic aspiration that goes beyond technical specification. The AI Nikkor 85mm f1.4s was that kind of lens. It always was, and it still is. This was the Nikon portrait lens, not because it was the only option, but because it was the right one. The 85mm focal length at f1.4 created a rendering of the world that felt almost cinematic. Backgrounds dissolving into softness, subjects gaining a presence and a weight that shorter lenses simply could not produce. Light falling in ways that made photographs look less like documents and more like art. If you shot portraits on Nikon in the film era and you wanted the best, this was the lens you were working toward. It was not cheap, it was not small, but it was worth every single compromise you made to have it. Maybe you owned one. Maybe you borrowed one from a friend and spent a weekend shooting with it and understood immediately why people talked about it the way they did. Maybe you just knew it by reputation, the way you know certain things are right without needing to be told twice. However, the 85mm f1.4s entered your photographic awareness, it left a mark. Because this was not just a portrait lens, this was Nikon at its most elegant. This was the lens that made photographers feel like the work they were doing was genuinely, seriously, beautifully worth doing. At number 4, we have the AI Nikkor 105mm f1.8s. The list has been building steadily, and this is where it starts to feel different. This is where the lenses stop being merely excellent and start feeling almost rarefied, glass that existed at a level most photographers could only approach carefully, with real intention and real commitment. The AI Nikkor 105mm EPIV 1.8s was that kind of lens. Fast, serious, unmistakably Nikon. f1.8 at 105mm was a combination that made very little practical sense if you were thinking purely about what most photographers needed. It was large. It was expensive. It demanded technique and attention in a way that slower glass did not. But for the photographers who wanted it, who sought it out, who saved for it, who mounted it on an f2 or an FM2 and looked through it for the first time, it made complete and total emotional sense. Because this was the lens that said you were not just shooting portraits. You were taking portraiture seriously in a way that very few photographers bothered to. The rendering this lens produced was distinctive. The way it separated a subject from its background at f1.8 was something you could see immediately, feel immediately, understand immediately as something beyond what ordinary portrait glass could do. It was a specialist lens in the truest sense. Not versatile, not designed for everything, but absolutely definitive for the specific thing it was designed to do. Photographers who used the 105mm f1.8s knew they were working with something exceptional. And that knowledge mattered in a way that is difficult to explain and completely unnecessary to explain to anyone who was actually there. At number 3, we have the AI Nikkor ED 180mm f2.8s. There is a specific kind of lens that becomes synonymous with professionalism, not because it is flashy, not because it draws attention to itself or makes the photographer holding it look impressive in a camera shop, but because it performs consistently and without drama at exactly the level that serious work requires. The AI Nikkor ED 180mm f2.8s was that lens for a generation of Nikon photographers who needed reach without losing quality and speed without losing class. The ED glass in this lens, extra low dispersion, for those who did not live through the era when that designation actually meant something new and significant, was Nikon's answer to the chromatic aberration problem that plagued long telephoto lenses at fast apertures. It meant that at f2.8, at 180mm, you were getting images that held their color fidelity, their sharpness, their overall integrity in a way that competing glass simply could not match. This was the telephoto that sports photographers used, that wildlife photographers trusted, that photojournalists brought out when they needed reach and could not afford to compromise on what they got back. If you shot Nikon professionally in the film era, you either owned a 180mm f2.8s or you wanted one. It was the lens that marked the line between serious amateur work and genuinely professional image making. Not because it was inaccessible, plenty of dedicated amateurs owned one, but because it performed at a professional level so consistently and so reliably that using it felt like a statement about what kind of photographer you intended to be. This was Nikon professionalism made physical. And for this audience, that means something that no modern equivalent can quite replicate. At number 2, we have the AI Noct-Nikkor 58mm f1.2. The hook mentioned it. You have been waiting for it. And here it is, the Noct-Nikkor, the dream lens, the lens that existed in a category almost entirely its own, not just fast, not just sharp, not just well-built, but genuinely, almost irrationally special in a way that transcended everything a practical photographer needed and went straight to the heart of what a photographer wanted. This was the lens Nikon built to solve a problem that most manufacturers were not even willing to admit existed. Point light sources at night, and the way most fast lenses rendered them was ugly. Coma. Aberration. Smearing. The Noct-Nikkor was built to fix that, using an aspherical element that was ground and polished entirely by hand by Nikon craftsmen to a standard that could not be replicated by machine. You did not need to own one to understand what it meant. You just needed to know it existed, that Nikon had looked at the problem of night photography and decided the correct response was to build something extraordinary, something that took the kind of time and skill and commitment that justified a price tag that put it out of reach for almost everyone. The Noct-Nikkor was not a lens for the working photographer. It was a lens for the photographer who had decided that the working photographer's constraints no longer applied to them. And in that sense, it was less a piece of glass than a kind of statement about Nikon's ambition at its absolute peak. Maybe you owned one. Maybe you tried one once and never quite got over it. Maybe you just read about it, saw images shot with it, understood through those images that something genuinely different was happening optically. However, the Noct entered your photography life. It left the way all legends leave, not entirely and not quietly. It is still here. It still matters. And the fact that Nikon eventually brought the Noct name back for a modern era tells you everything you need to know about what this lens meant to the people who actually lived through its original chapter. At number 1, we have the AI Nikkor 105mm f2.5. And here we are. Not the fastest lens on this list, not the most exotic, not the one with the mythological backstory, or the aspherical element ground by hand, or the price tag that put it in a category most photographers could only admire from a distance. The AI Nikkor 105mm f2.5 was none of those things. And it is number 1 on this list for exactly that reason, because what it was something more durable and more meaningful than any of those qualities. It was the lens that became part of Nikon itself. Think about what that means for a moment. There are lenses that impress. There are lenses that inspire. There are lenses that define categories and push boundaries and make manufacturers look visionary. And then there are lenses that become so deeply woven into the identity of a system that separating them from the brand feels almost impossible. The 105mm f2.5 was that for Nikon. Photographers used it. Portrait photographers swore by it. Photojournalists reached for it. Steve McCurry used one to make one of the most recognized photographs ever taken. And if you know which photograph that is, you already understand exactly what this lens was capable of in the right hands. But the legend of the 105mm f2.5 was never just about that one image. It was about the thousands of images that photographers made with it over decades. Portraits, reportage, travel photography, personal work that accumulated into a collective memory of what this focal length and this particular rendering could do. f2.5 was fast enough to be genuinely useful in low light, slow enough to be perfectly controlled, and the image quality it produced had a quality that photographers recognized immediately as something beyond the ordinary. It was sharp where sharpness mattered and beautifully, naturally soft where softness was right. It was balanced in a way that felt less like engineering and more like instinct. If you shot Nikon in the film era, you have a relationship with this lens. Maybe you owned one. Maybe you borrowed one. Maybe you shot alongside another photographer who used one and studied the images they brought back and understood, quietly and completely, why this was the lens serious Nikon photographers talked about the way they did. That relationship is the reason this lens is number 1, not because it was the most impressive on this list, but because it is the most remembered, and memory, in the end, is the only ranking that really matters. If this video brought back something real for you, a lens, a camera, a moment from your time shooting film, leave it in the comments below. Tell us the lens you remember most. And if you want more videos like this, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. This is just the beginning of the archive we are building here, and every video goes deeper. Some lenses impressed people, some lenses stayed with them. The difference between those two things is what this channel is really about. The 105mm f2.5 did not just perform, it endured in the memory of every photographer who ever looked through it and felt, for a moment, like the work they were doing was exactly right. That is what the best Nikon glass did. It did not just take pictures, it made photographers feel like photographers. And for the people who were there, no modern specification sheet will ever fully replace that feeling. This was Alt Buzz Lenses. We will see you in the next one.